Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our podcast, The Next Page from Library and Archives, UN Geneva. Today, I have in the studio with me Ioana Popp, who's the founder and executive director of an organization called UNaccountable. She will tell us in a minute about herself, about the organization, and what their mission is. And in this podcast, she will help us explore the concept and examples of relational accountability, what it is, how it works, how it is linked to the new Pact for the future, and what is, for you, the audience, what is in there that you can learn and take away from the episode in terms of this concept that has been discussed in the corporate world for a while, but it applies across the UN system in a special way. And I believe the UNaccountable is looking into these forms of relational accountability within and among international organizations. So I'm very curious about this, and I'm eager to learn more about relational accountability at ecosystemic level. But before we go there, Ioana, welcome to our studio. Welcome to the podcast and to the Library and Archives. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about you, your background, your current job, and what motivates you in your current mission with UNaccountable.
Hello, Francesco. Thank you for having me, and hello to the listeners. It is very exciting to talk about UNaccountable. A bit about myself. I'm the founder and executive director of this relatively new, independent, Geneva-based organization that is called UNaccountable, whose mission is precisely to make multilateralism more effective and impactful. This initiative stems very much from my observations working in government at the capital level and at the permanent mission here in Geneva, as well as for the UN. Observations that show that there have been so many reform attempts to make the UN more accountable, more responsive to the expectations of the different stakeholders. And at best, these have had an impact that was positive, but not sufficient as a whole. And I was wondering whether it was worthwhile to do an experiment, to set up an entity that is completely outside of the UN system, therefore completely removed from the interests and ways of working of a specific UN entity or of member states, but working together with them all to develop and test and implement innovative solutions that can identify the main pain points of the UN, if you will, and radically and constructively improve the way the UN works to deliver the results that everyone expects. The logic was to focus on the distinctive feature of the UN. And what is that? The UN is not merely an implementing entity. No. It is a body that has been built to have member states, UN entities, and even observers, civil society organizations, discuss and seek solutions to our world's greatest challenges. This is about developing consensus decisions and setting priorities for joint work. This also implies that the UN system, as we understand it in UNaccountable, is not just about the different UN agencies, but it really is about the interaction and the dynamic between the different stakeholders groups that compose this very rich and important ecosystem. We're talking about the UN entities themselves, of course, but also about the different member states that join together in the different fora. It is also about civil society organizations that have an ECOSOC status and contribute to the different debates within the UN. It's also about the implementing partners on the ground and many other stakeholders that are tied in a way or another with different interests, with different ways of engaging with the system. So this is in a way the richness of the UN, the richness of multilateralism, really. But it also has, if we look at the other side, this presents a complexity. This means that it is an ecosystem that is built of very different entities that have very different governing configurations, that have different priorities, different mandates, who evolve in different ways, different budgets, but also different ways of working. So the challenge is, how do we create a UN system that delivers at the best of the expectations of the different stakeholders? How do we track its impact globally when it's composed of so many different entities? So the logic in setting up UNaccountable was, let's try something radically different. So I set it up as a startup, deliberately to create the most nimble, most flexible organization, completely removed from the UN system, but working together with member states, with UN system entities, and with civil society organizations. The logic was to have a very flexible organization, not one that would grow a bureaucracy, but one that would focus very specifically on the structural challenges that the UN system agencies face. It wouldn't focus on a single event or a single entity, and it would focus on which areas can be improved, really to build up an even stronger organization. The goal, the mission, if you will, Francisco, to respond to your question, was about increasing trust in UN's capacity by making its work more transparent, more accessible, but also to get a clearer overview of its impact and comparative advantage relative to other international organizations. This, in turn, would, I believe, make it work better and in a more recognized way for the people which it is supposed to serve.
Great. So now let's go into, for the sake of clarity with our audience, the concept, the ABC of relational accountability. So a little bit on what it is, where it comes from, how it works, maybe a couple of examples before we go into really the deep dive of the trade-offs and how it applies across this ecosystem that is multidimensional. It's not only the organizations, it's between and among organizations, it's with member states, and member states coalesce in boards, executive boards across organizations. So a member state is a stakeholder and a shareholder in so many different organizations. So the complexity is really mind-boggling. So let's go first into the concepts and what is there to be learned about relational accountability.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francisco. And you said it yourself. The task is great. The UN system is very complex and its work is ever growing. I think that should be recognized. It's not a static system, but one that grows with every meeting, every report, every decision that is taken. Mandates are adapted, amended, they grow. So how do we keep track of that? And I think relational accountability is at the heart of it. To provide a little bit of context, I made the observation that there have been so many initiatives to reform the UN system, but what they all have in common is that they focused on a specific stakeholder set. So to give you one example, the Security Council reform. The well-known Security Council reform is essentially about how the member states engage with each other. You mentioned member states' executive boards. So many initiatives in different agencies to reform and improve how the stakeholders, the shareholders of the UN system entities engage and interact and reach decisions together to provide guidance to the organization. Another example, UN development system reforms. It is comparably similar in the sense that it's about how different UN system agencies interact, partner, collaborate on the ground to deliver the SDGs. The observation I made was that there was no known effort to analyze how the different stakeholder sets work together to deliver results on the ground. We look at what we call management accountability and how that can be improved. So once there is a consensus decision, once everybody agreed on the SDGs and the need to implement them, there have been means of tracking the extent to which that has been done. However, there hasn't been an effort to analyze the extent to which the stakeholder sets contribute most effectively to multilateralism that is impactful. In other words, what are the areas in which we can improve how member states interact amongst themselves to reach decisions, how member states interact with the UN system agencies, perhaps in the different governing body meetings? What are the interdependencies? Where are the tensions? Where what we call pain points, and how can we address those? Similarly, what about civil society organizations and how they engage with the UN system? Relational accountability looks at these dynamics. Who has the answer on how the UN system can work better? of course, the three sets of stakeholders that I mentioned: member states, UN system agencies, and civil society organizations. If we start with a basic definition of accountability, are organizations doing what they should be doing in the way in which it is most appropriate, efficient, and impactful? Who would answer those questions most legitimately? It would be these three stakeholder sets. So at UNaccountable, we use the first 2 years since it's set up to conduct over 200 semi-structured interviews or workshops with these three stakeholder sets to understand what their expectation of the UN system is. And it's been fascinating to see what the results are, what they refer to as a priority for the UN's work, and whom they refer to as stakeholders whose attributes should change to make multilateralism more effective. 98% of those we talked to said the UN should be more accountable. Well, what is fascinating is that they talked about different things. They talked about participation of civil society organizations in the UN system. Other people talked about the relevance of mandates of UN system agencies. Yet other people talked about transparency, about ethical behavior of international staff. So relational accountability is about all these concepts brought together, because in the end, it's about what the different stakeholder sets see as a priority for the UN. So relational accountability is about the actions or interactions, the steps that each stakeholder needs to undertake in order to enable another stakeholder to do its job well. So some key aspects of relational accountability would be non-earmarked funding, would be a preference for effective participation and inclusion of civil society organizations in different meetings, but also tracking their results. So it is about making sure that each stakeholder set has the tools that it needs in order to effectively participate in the work of the UN. To give you one example that arose in consultation, it is clear that the capacity of member states varies greatly when it comes to exercising their role in the UN entity's governing body. So relational accountability is about making sure that everybody has the tools that they need to participate. This is not about some states having more funds or more capacity relative to others. It's about factoring in the body of work that every diplomat needs to take on to do its job. It is about considering the impact of producing more rules and regulation or more documents or creating more decisions and how that will impact the capacity of another member state.
And it's true that as the UN system has developed over time, over the past, almost 8 decades, it has become inextricably linked to all the challenges that were developing within the international landscape. Think of climate change, for example, and how the UN system was there before climate change, and while climate change was on the way to becoming the global crisis it is today. And so how these parts of the system interact has become, if not chaotic, extremely complex. And so one of the things that struck me while I was a little bit researching to prepare this episode was the fact that, and I think that this is said by your organization, UNaccountable, the fact that along the long history of UN organization and UN system reform attempts, which is basically an ongoing work. When you have an organization of this width, of course, you're reforming all the time, even if you're not saying it. But all these attempts focused on parts of the engine, and very rarely or almost never on how the parts of the vehicle interact together. How the parts of the vehicle interact and are accountable to one another is the focus of what you've been researching and what you're trying to do with UNaccountable. And it's pretty innovative as an approach. So let's look a little bit deeper into how it works and how the trade-offs emerge when you look at application of relational accountability at this scale of complexity and with this number of mandates across the entire UN system. And I would like also to sort of throw a challenge to you. We just adopted the Pact for the Future. Now, the Pact for the Future A simplistic reading of the Pact of the Future is a sequence of commitments that have the capacity to really influence the trajectory of our civilization going forward. And it's a list of things that we shall do, basically. And that really poses the question of how the parts of the system are going to be inter-accountable reciprocally to work together towards this goal. So, but the challenge for you, are you able to help us understand whether relational accountability is really important as we go forward into implementing the Pact for the Future, given what you've been saying, and given also what you've been finding out in your research with the international organization and stakeholders that you mentioned with the semi-structured interviews?
Thank you for that question, a very complex one. And I think you've said it so well. The Summit of the Future has been an enormous exercise, which engaged all stakeholders of the UN system as we look at it. So that in and of itself is something that helps to keep momentum on reforming and improving the UN system. As you also mentioned, it is entirely normal for a growing bureaucracy to seek to adapt, change, and improve its work. And that happens in any type of organization. Relational accountability, I believe, really is key in making the sequence of commitments, included in the Pact for the Future, actionable. And its accompanying model, if you will, the methodology, the meta-analysis of how the UN works, what we call the Accountability Maturity Assessment Model, provides this actionable framework to take those commitments forward and to make the UN system work better. Relational accountability is how things will be attempted in a different way and in a way that is more comprehensive. And this, by the way, is also in response to a recent Joint Inspection Unit report, which was issued in the summer of 2023. That excellent report on accountability was the first to issue the recommendation, even before the process of the Summit of the Future, to develop a system-wide reference accountability maturity assessment model framework. The logic there is precisely the one you refer to, that the engine, the big machine of the UN system, does not work in isolation, and that the different UN agencies work together to deliver results. It is also about recognizing that it is good that the different UN agencies are different, because the world's challenges need different approaches. Different political priorities are more suited to different ways of work, but it is also about using a framework that allows us to bring all this together to better predict and analyze its impact, and to also understand, in response to your question on trade-offs, how this applies to the different UN agencies. So in a way, breaking down the sequence of actions that are included in the Pact, breaking that down into operational guidance, breaking that down in chunks of action that each agency can do, and also understanding from the perspective of each stakeholder how one's actions will influence that. To give you an example of trade-offs and how working in one area of accountability of an organization can affect and can have unseen perverse effects in another, many stakeholders in the consultations refer to there not being sufficient procedures or sufficiently explicit processes for different ways in which the UN is working. This would create greater documentation. Let's imagine an organization, the International Organization of Accountability, which operates with 2,000 staff and has 15 procedures that the staff needs to follow in order to create a project, which leads to a project being from conceptualization to implementation, it requiring 7 signatures and 27 days to implement. This is an organization which is very nimble, very fast, very agile, and creates results very quickly. That is a very good example for an organization that is focused on project implementation. One could say that this is a trade-off in the area of quality decision-making and consultation, in the sense that speed and agility mean that there's not sufficient time to consult, perhaps, with all the relevant beneficiaries, perhaps not sufficient time to consult with the different civil society organizations that are based in Geneva and actively engage with the system. More procedures would make quality decision-making higher. It would improve, perhaps, the quality of the work of the project, but it would also increase the burden for each stakeholder to prepare, for each stakeholder to go through the documents ahead of the different meetings. More procedures also mean, yes, explicit process and expectations, but perhaps a greater risk for inadvertent contradictions and inconsistencies between the growing body of procedures that is within an organization, but also across the system when we have multiple organizations working on the same SDG. That also means heavier responsibility for staff to follow the procedures. And this can create an organizational disincentive to delegation of authority. So I think it's all about achieving a delicate balance that makes sense in a specific organizational context. And if we go back to the meta-analysis, it's about having the evidence that decision makers need in order to create a large, complex UN ecosystem composed of many different, highly efficient UN organizations, each delivering the best results in a specific area, and all contributing in their own way to a UN system that delivers results at large, without gaps, and with fewer contradictions.
Thank you so much. I can perceive that the concept is, at the same time, easy, but difficult to explain. And actually, while you were describing this imaginary organization with their imaginary work processes, yeah, it resonates with me. My experience, I have over 3 years of experience in various UN agencies and in the Secretariat. And the things you've said resonate with me in different portions of my professional experience with organizations that were nimbler, but with less time for inclusivity and consultation, as you said. And other organizations that were, moving the cursor a whole lot more on inclusivity and consultation, having difficulties in churning out results as anticipated in the program budget, for example, which is an exercise that you do before you get down to work. So in that sense, what you're saying is simple to grasp for anyone that has experience with complex or large organizational corporations. But it's also difficult to explain in theory. So I was wondering if you could also tell us a little bit more of how your professional work right now, in this moment, is planning to bring this into the reality of international organizations. So a little bit perhaps, what's ahead for UNaccountable as an entity that is trying to actually offer models and processes for this hyper-complex ecosystem that is operating, let's remind ourselves, in a hyper-complex environment, trying to run after super complex global challenges. So nothing in here is simple, and it's actually our appreciation of the complexity of it all that makes a huge difference. Things have become really, really complex. So, could you give us a little bit of anticipation of what's coming?
Yes, that's the secret sauce, no? Not only grasping the complexity, but also identifying exactly how it can be moved forward. The very exciting time that we live in is one that allows us to solve this puzzle, I think. There is so much information about the UN. There's so many reports produced by the different organizations, by the different stakeholders. The challenge, I think, that every stakeholder raised in one way or another was having access to consolidated information that is relevant, that fulfills their needs at a given time, and that is easily accessible. So UNaccountable is developing an AI-powered solution that can provide an answer to those questions. This is about keeping stakeholders engaged, but this is also about providing them with the right type of information that they need to do their job more effectively. 80% of my time in the different roles I had was about identifying where to look for a specific information, in which report, is it updated, is it published, do I have access to it, can I cross-reference it with information from another report? And I saw as I transitioned from a role to another that there were some similar questions. So I wonder, wouldn't our time, our intellectual capacity, our political capital, and our financial resources not be better used if we would have instant access to the impact that the different UN agencies have on the ground? If we could predict where donor X would put $100, what impact would that create? If we could see reducing the number of procedures that we discussed earlier from 54 to 27, would that really create a huge trade-off in terms of trust in the UN system? What would we predict to be the consequence? If we would have the answer to those questions in a way that is focused on the user, driven by the user, empowering each stakeholder to engage with the UN system, having the information, being able to trace it back to the source, and focusing their efforts on where their stakeholder role is best suited, wouldn't that make for multilateralism that is more effective? So UNaccountable is working on that solution, and I'm excited to see where this will go.
One question more before we go and to the wrap-up part of our conversation. What you're saying makes me think that treating and analyzing a massive quantity of data is one of the parts of the secret sauce you mentioned in the beginning. So, and that leads me to the use of AI. So those are things typically that AI and even pre-gen AI could help us do, when we look at the impact, for example, on the ground, not one agency, because it's never only one agency, but the complexity of them all, different timescales for different mandates, reacting to different forms of liquidity or other form of crisis for the organizations themselves. That question of the impact could be seen treating, tons of data using AI. So is this part of what UNaccountable is seeing in the future, AI helping with relational accountability?
I think an AI-powered solution that is very transparent in which information it uses and where it is sourced from is a key means to help stakeholders develop relational accountability. Relational accountability will always be about how stakeholders engage. It will always be about a diplomat's decision to focus its effort to reach consensus with the discretion that that type of work requires. But it is about facilitating and making more efficient those aspects of work that can be outsourced. Using an analyst's time to seep through different reports when one just needs the dollar value of a specific budget line in different agencies, or the percentage of overhead comparative across the system, or was there a growth in a specific country? How many cases of ILO AT settlements have there been? These are pieces of information that are key in making decisions that need not occupy the time of our staff. Staff that, by the way, keeps on changing, which leads to gaps in capacity, which leads to inconsistencies in decisions between the different stakeholders, but also across time. So I think using a dashboard to help us crunch the numbers, to help us make sense of the complexity of the system and of the large volume of data that a single person or a single permanent mission or even a single agency cannot conceivably do. I think that is the key. I think that is something that will really make a difference and will take us a step closer to relational accountability.
Thank you so much. As we wrap up the episode, would you please tell our audience where they can find out more about the work you're doing right now, maybe the sources to know more about relational accountability, know more UNaccountable, and maybe know more also about the accountability maturity model that you mentioned before?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the opportunity for that. UNaccountable has a website, which is probably the first stop for finding out more information about UNaccountable, its background, how it was set up, its structure, but also about the maturity assessment model and relational accountability as a broader concept. It is also where we will post updates on the solutions that have been accepted and seen as useful. www.un-accountable.ch, and we also have a LinkedIn page you're welcome to visit.
Thank you so much. So, Ioana Popp, founder and executive director of UNaccountable, among other things, among your research in academic and also your service in the diplomatic community. Thank you so much for taking the time for being with us on our podcast.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for the invitation, for having me here, and also to the listeners for staying with us.